Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm looking at the political, economic and social condition of the Soviet Union in 1941. This is part of my playlist on Tsarist and Communist Russia, designed to cover A-level history, in particular component 1H from AQA. Now this is a really important staging post in the development of the USSR, as we're just about to see them enter the Second World War or Great War. And so this is really important in questions which kind of set up an evaluation or judgment about how successful or the degree of change that has taken place in the Soviet Union between 1917 and 1941 under communist rule. So the Spec says what you need to know is the political, economic and social condition of the Soviet Union by 1941. And again, as I've said already, this is going to help us reflect on the degree of progress that has been made or the lack of it between 1917 and 1941. So to start off with, I'm going to look at the political condition of the USSR in 1941, and we're going to start with the strengths. So Stalin, you can argue, politically had never been any stronger. There was no meaningful opposition left at all. I mean, unsurprisingly, there was no political opposition left at this point because of the extent of the purges. And what it had done is it had created a system in the USSR where promotion and position was based purely on loyalty to Stalin. That is going to cause problems because it means that essentially promotion is not based on ability, really, but you get promoted if you are absolutely loyal to Stalin, and that is the main consideration for advancement to power. Stalin therefore has the authority to impose his will on everyone around him, and this wasn't as hard as it is to argue, really. This was a real strength of the Soviet Union when it came to the conduct of the Second World War, because you need centralized, strong central decision making. You've got someone who's completely unchallenged. There is no division at the top, and therefore there is a clear line of direction. Now, there's going to be mistakes and problems as we go through, as Stalin goes through this, but at least there is that kind of uniformity, that kind of lack of division. The cult of personality that Stalin had developed around himself was very effective. It secured loyalty and devotion to him from a large portion of the Soviet people. Again, a useful thing going into a war. There'd been this period of rapid economic transformation. This had brought to many people personal insecurity. The purges had caused this huge widespread fear. But many people believed that the person who could take Russia forward and make these things better was Stalin, ironically, and all the mistakes and excesses were blamed on others, on local officials or key figures like Yesov, and so who got the blame for the Great Purge. So, and the propaganda of the late 30s had focused on Stalin's cult of personality and increasingly on nationalist and patriotic feeling. Again, creating this idea of togetherness or unity moving into the war years, and it helped the Soviet government and Stalin in particular. The Soviet people had essentially been prepared and were ready for that kind of demands of war and putting country first. Now, there is, of course, many weaknesses in this system as well, because of the strength of the Stalin's dominance over it. What he created was an incredibly conservative political system. There was no place for new ideas or responding to grassroots opinion. In fact, you were a very brave person to express any kind of opinion before waiting to see what Stalin's view was first. So loyalty to Stalin is the only important characteristic you need for political advancement. So that means there is strong political control, but that is not necessarily a vibrant or productive or effective political system to have, and it becomes rather stagnant. And you have a lack of innovation, and you have people who are fearful of criticizing anything the party does, even if it is clearly flawed or not working, because you might be seen as being counter-revolutionary, you might be seen as an enemy of the people, and terrible things would follow. Now we're going to move on to the economics strengths of the USSR at this point. And they are quite numerous, really. So the 5-year plans may have been fairly chaotic and inefficient, and yes, it could have all been run a lot better. But there were some stunning successes: the creation of new cities like Magnitogorsk, which was built from scratch. They built these incredible hydroelectric dams, and these were symbols of achievement and the power and effectiveness of the plans. If you look at raw material productions, increasing steel production by both 400%, coal by 600% between 1928 and 1941, without those kinds of movement, those kinds of gains, and it would be almost impossible to see the Soviet Union managing to fight off Nazi Germany in World War II. The allowing of the peasants to cultivate their own private plots on the collective farms and sell products at market after 35 had led to some improvement in the supply of fresh vegetables, eggs and meats into the cities, therefore improving the diets of the workers. And after 34, there was a decline in peasant resistance to collectivization. It's led to a kind of a slow recovery in agricultural production. So by the time you get to 41, the position of industry has moved forward. There's been more stuff. There's a lot more being produced. Agriculture has got better. Now, obviously, you can argue that the party creates the problems that mean that agricultural production has been so bad. But by 41, a lot of the damage that had been done had been recovered to some extent. Obviously, again, with all the horror and the terrible human costs that have come with this. Now, as I've said, without these massive improvements in production, then it's impossible to see that the Soviet Union would survive the German invasion. And the decentralized nature of the Soviet economy helped the war effort. Decisions were made at the center about war production and then immediately implemented. And probably one of the best examples of this is as the German army advanced into Russian territory, the Soviet authorities had organized to move many of the factories. They simply pulled down and rebuilt beyond the Ural Mountains. Now, this is a massive undertaking, but without it, then huge areas of production would have been left, well, in the hands of the German army, but instead they remained under Soviet control. And so this was an example of effective economic planning. There were some very significant economic weaknesses in the USSR in this period, and collectivization in particular had overall proven to be very unsuccessful. So although we can point to those kind of improvements by 41, the initial push had been met with such fierce resistance, and many of the peasants had resisted. Now, some of those could genuinely be described as kulaks. Many of those actually really weren't. And the subsequent slaughter of this group and the destruction of property and of livestock and of crops did long-term damage to the agricultural production in the USSR. Just in terms of manpower, the thought of this is mind-blowing in terms of the amount that had been lost, and also the fact that essentially you run the most risk of being accused of being a kulak if you were an effective farmer. And so you lost a lot of the effective workforce. And we've seen in previous videos how there was people sent out to run collective farms who had no idea what they were doing. And this big, centrally planned economy proved very difficult to operate effectively or efficiently. The whole economy was just too big to be controlled entirely from Moscow. And so the bureaucracy became rather inefficient, and endemic features of this Soviet economic system we start to see in this, and that the enormous amount of red tape, the kind of messing around with the numbers to make it look like things were better than they were, and low quality goods being produced rather than just because they had to get the numbers through. Now, where there were problems and things were inefficient or not working, the Persians created this situation where people were very reluctant to put forward ideas to solve it, or show any form of initiative, because if you showed any form of initiative, the people probably didn't like it. You could get into a lot of trouble. I mean, one of the other problems of doing well, even if it was well received, doing well and getting would lead to being promoted. If you were promoted, then you would end up in a even more kind of vulnerable position, because the people who were most vulnerable to things like the purchase were the people who were in charge. So you might come to some great ideas of improving efficiency in your factory. You get promoted, but then you're one of the experts, and if things then don't meet the next target as it goes up, you're the one who gets into trouble. Thousands of managers were arrested for sabotage or wrecking when they failed to meet those targets. So you can see why people might be reluctant to put their hand up and try and rise up the ranks. And this culture of fear is obviously clearly counterproductive, as people would rather cover up mistakes rather than make improvements. Even something promoted as a source of strength, such as the Stakhanovite movement, could have its downsides. Otherwise, other workers resented the privilege that these people had and the higher status that they were given. And the managers often didn't appreciate the having to support the attempts of workers to become Stakhanovites, as it disrupted the normal routine of production. So all of this kind of means that we got a lot of negativity around what should have been the key moments of success. Moving on to social condition USSR and looking at some of the social improvements. Well, there are some big gains. I mean, one of the most noticeable in this is literacy rates. The literacy rates in 1941 were much higher than they had been in 1924, for example. This was largely due to the much wider level of education that was available, both in the cities and in the rural areas. The quota system for entry to higher education for the proletariat had been abolished, but there was still much higher representation of the working class people and women in higher education than ever before. And so we start to see kind of real successes in terms of things like Soviet science. There was greater access to social services such as healthcare and nursery care, and this contributed to more women entering the workforce, though this often was out of economic necessity rather than because there was great the quality of childcare services available. There was social mobility. Someone from proletarian or peasant background could rise through the ranks of the party if they demonstrated some talent, but most of all if they demonstrated absolutely undying loyalty to Stalin and willingness to carry out his orders. There are, of course, and in these things, massive downsides as well. There was considerable disruption to many people's lives due to economic policy, where families were split as one or more members left the countryside to work in the new industrial cities. Living conditions in the cities were really harsh. There was a culture of fear and blame in the industrial workplace, and this led to people changing jobs and where they lived really often. The working class obviously endured terrible conditions and dangerous conditions at work, and there was really harsh discipline, particularly as we ramp up to 41, which means that even minor offences faced really kind of brutal punishments as the push for production, particularly in armaments, was driven forwards. So all of this creates a kind of a really unproductive culture of fear and avoiding responsibility and things that an unhappy workforce in many different ways. And this culture of fear was made even worse by the purges because of the quota system that had been brought in. Arrests essentially were often completely arbitrary or based on the tiniest bits of evidence. And therefore, this broke down things like the norms of morality and trust and friendship, because you might have to distance yourself from people if they got arrested very quickly and not want to show that you've been close friends with them because of the ramifications that could have. Women were still very much treated as second-class citizens in many respects, and we talked about the dual demands that placed on women, so they had to continue with the traditional duties of childcare and homemaking, with the new demands of working, as the pressure to meet the targets of the 5 years plans continued all the way through this period. So to try and draw some conclusions about where the Soviet Union was in 41, well, there are considerable strengths, and the main illustration that's always used on to back this up is the fact the Soviet Union, obviously with the support of the Allies, goes on to defeat Nazi Germany in 45. And Stalin had created a system that was centered on himself, a very much a personal dictatorship. So in terms of political authority, I mean, there's no doubting he very much definitely had this at this point. And he held this genuine conviction that he was this person who could drive Russia forward, had the vision to bring about true socialism in Russia. And he believed that what was right for him was also right for the Soviet Union. And what's important here is, particularly because of the cult of personality, it wasn't just him that believed it. Millions of others did as well. The majority of the weaknesses in 41 concerned the suffering of the people. Now, to Stalin, these would seem like necessary sacrifices to ensure the survival of socialism. And again, going back to the earlier point, would be justified by the defeat of Nazi Germany. To say, well, look, he said that they were 50 to 100 years behind and they had to make this up very quickly or be crushed, and they did, and they weren't. And so he would say, well, the kind of the ends justified the means, and he would also point to, well, he wouldn't, because he wouldn't necessarily have known directly, but stories pointed to the fact that prisoners in the gulags were cheering Stalin's name when the news of the final victory reported. I mean, there are even crazy stories where if we go on a little bit further down the line, where people in the gulags are crying with sadness when Stalin died, and you're thinking this is a political system which stuck you in here, which is because of him. And yeah, that's the strength of the cult of personality. Now, historians obviously have the benefit of hindsight. So while Stalin at the time might see it all as being absolutely necessary and a great success, obviously that's not a view as a historian we are likely to take as read. Now, the political system and economic system that Stalin created stifled initiative, it stifled innovation and creativity. It brought suffering to the Russian people on a scale that had never been experienced before. The collectivization was a failure. It created an inefficient and unproductive agricultural system which was massively resisted. The command economy ultimately is unable to compete with the capitalist system in the West, and in its war efforts, the Soviet Union has to rely very strongly on economic support from Western nations such as the USA. The political system had become stagnant and very, very conservative, again, with people not pushing new ideas or daring to challenge any idea that Stalin had. And so communism wasn't adapting and wasn't developing, and that is something that would ultimately lead to its downfall 50 years down the line. Now, not all of the long-term weaknesses in the Soviet system were absolutely apparent in 41. The Stalin's revolution did produce a kind of series of heroic successes. So many people were better off materially and had opportunities they hadn't had before. So in a lot of ways, the Russian people were better off than they had been under the Tsarist system. But they lived in fear, and they feared arrest, and they feared trials, and there was enormous human suffering. So life was hard, and millions died and were repressed by this authoritarian regime. So in this, it's very difficult to see that Stalin had achieved great success by 41, despite links and things that can be made to the war because of what was done to get there. So I hope this video has been helpful for you. Please, if you have liked it, hit like. If you haven't done already, then do subscribe. There's plenty more videos on this topic and other historical ones, as well as a whole range on A-level politics. And again, thank you very much for watching.